Welcome to TheKillFile, your favorite true crime podcast with host Britney Spears. Settle in and lock your doors as we crawl into the dark corners of true crime. In TheKillFile, nothing stays buried forever.
Hello there, and welcome to episode 102 of TheKillFile. I am so glad that you guys are back for another story. Before we jump into today's case, a few quick reminders. First, check out the website, TheKillFile.com, to find the merch shop for some fun true crime gear that helps to support the podcast, and find where you can suggest a case you want me to cover. Next, the Hidden Files will be back, but for now, if you're interested in checking out the kind of podcast that it will be, you can find a couple of episodes here on the main channel or head over to TheKillFile on Patreon to find some there. Don't forget to follow us on social media. We're on TikTok, Blue Sky, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. More posts each week are on the way about the cases with extra pictures, behind-the-scene content from making of the podcast, and weekly reminders about the cases. Finally, if you haven't yet, please take a moment to rate, review, subscribe, or follow wherever you get your podcasts for the newest episodes each Monday. It helps to boost the podcast in the lists for others to find us and follow along. I am working right now, besides more on social media content, but I'm also trying to figure out how to get the best sound. As I host the podcast on Spotify, it apparently does some heavy compression when it comes to the audio, so instead of switching platforms again, I'm working on tweaking it, so bear with me as I'm a few weeks ahead of schedule, and I won't hear the changes until the episodes come out. Also, there are some changes that you can make on your own end if the audio sounds off. It could be your listening device or Spotify settings. I'm doing my best to make the quality the best that I can. It's hard without any audio lessons or classes or whatever. I'm learning as I go. So my hope is one day to get some help with the podcast, including a sound person or producer that can add some sound effects or whatever to the podcast episodes. Not too much, because to me that's sometimes distracting when I listen, but just a few light sounds here and there. But for now, just remember that it's just me and I have no fucking clue what I'm doing. I'm doing my best when I research and watch videos. Hang in there, one day it will be higher quality, I promise. Anyways, that's it for business. Let's talk about today's case. Today, we are going to be talking about someone that I have not heard of, but I am excited to get into, a man named Johann Otto Hoch, aka the Bluebeard Murderer. Last note, it has been brought to my attention that as we are a true crime podcast, most of us might know what we're getting ourselves into when we come here to listen. Maybe I don't need to list out all of the trigger warnings for each of the cases, so I've decided that I will list the full trigger warnings in the show notes for anyone who may need them, and the only warning that I'm going to give from now on are when it's crimes against children. Let's get to it. They say, if you're lucky, you'll find love at some point in your lifetime. Some people are lucky enough to find it more than once. Someone who sees you for the person you are, who loves you despite your flaws. Someone who makes you feel safe in a cold and unforgiving world. But what happens when that person that you've trusted with your heart, love, and life is hiding something darker? What if the warm smile across the dinner table belongs to a predator, and the vows of devotion are nothing more than a death sentence waiting to be carried out? Unfortunately for many lonely-hearted women across America in the early 1900s, they would find out the answer to this horrific question, because sometimes the greatest danger isn't lurking in the shadows. Sometimes it's the person sleeping right beside you. A 46-year-old woman named Marie Walker owned and ran a little candy store in the greater Chicago area. After divorcing her first husband, Marie would stumble upon an advertisement in a German paper called the Chicago Abend Post, reading, quote, "Matrimonial German. Own home. Wishes acquaintance of widow without children. Object, matrimony. Address, M422 Abend Post." End quote. Marie, in turn, would ask her sister, a woman named Miss Bertha Sohn, to write a letter to the man for her, which read, quote, "Dear Sir, in answer to your honorable advertisement, I hereby inform you that I am a lady standing alone. I am 46 and have a small business, also a few $100s. If you are in earnest, I tell you I shall be. I may be seen at 12 Willow Street, Marie Walker." End quote. It's so romantic, right? Not like today is any better. Had this conversation gone down online today, it would be more like, "Hey, you're hot. Want to send me some pics of your boobs?" When Johann received the response from Marie, he would dial up the candy store on December 6, 1904, where the two would have a long talk, in which Johann would describe his own situation to Marie. Johann would go on to say that he himself was a widow for the last 2 years, that he owned a cottage in Vale that he rented out alongside some vacant lots around the cottage, that he at the time had $8,000, which in today's money would be almost $375,000. Get ready for a lot of that conversion on money. Johann would also tell Marie that his father was an 81-year-old man living in Germany, and when his father died, he stood to inherit another $15,000, which would be roughly $561,000 in today's money. Well, after hearing all of this, Marie must have been impressed because Johann became a regular visit of the candy shop over the next few days, when the couple would decide that they should get married. Like now. On December 10th, just a few days after meeting, Marie and Johann would get married. Afterwards, Marie would sell her candy store for what sources said was $75, which is around $2,800 today, which she then gave to Johann, alongside of her life savings of $350, aka $13,000 today. Marie did this because her new husband would explain that he needed the money to get the house he owned ready for them to move in, and his money at the time had all been tied up. Just 1 week after Johann and Marie were married, Marie would become extremely ill with unbearable stomach pain, vomiting pretty consistently, claiming that in all of her extremities she had a weird tingling sensation, all the while basically dying of thirst. Marie would describe the tingling as a wave of ants creeping through her skin, and as Dr. John Reese made his way to the couple on the 20th of December, his diagnosis would consist of nephritis, which is inflammation of the kidneys, and cystitis, which is inflammation of the bladder. Marie had another sister who herself was widowed and had met Johann before, when he would learn that the sister, Miss Emily Fisher, also had a little savings of her own, $893, aka over $33,000 today. When Johann sent for Emily, wanting her to come help and or visit her sick sister, I guess she came around often to help around the house. During the first visit, after Marie fell ill, as Johann was walking Emily to her car, Johann confessed that if he had met her first, he would have actually married her instead of her sister. After visits where Emily came to help Johann and Marie, I guess it became clear to Marie that her new husband and her sister were a bit too friendly with one another, which allegedly sent Marie into a jealous tizzy, where Emily stormed out of the house. However, she eventually returned. Just after the newlyweds' first month anniversary, poor Marie would pass away, with what the doctor stated was her inflamed bladder and kidneys the reason of her death. I can't imagine being a doctor back in the day, or even a regular person. Like, no one really knew what the fuck was going on as far as medicine and science went back then. And let's be honest, 120 years ago isn't that long, considering how far we've come in those areas. I often wonder, how many murderers actually got away with it because things were misdiagnosed, considered suicides when they really weren't, or the authorities just plain could not solve the mystery. When the moment arrived where Marie passed, her sister happened to be at the house, and within just a few moments of her sister's death, Johann proposed to Emily. Yeah, right after. Come on, man, what the fuck is wrong with you? Well, Emily said that it was too soon, from her sister just dying, but in an article in the Hold in Progress from March 1905, Emily would state that after the funeral was over, and over his own wife's grave, he asked her again to marry him. A few days later, he showed up at her house asking to marry her yet again, and this time she agreed. The two would travel to Joliet, which is said to be about 40 miles southwest of Chicago, where the two would be married in secret. She must have been like, "No, sir, this is too soon. After the passing of my sister, let's wait until after the funeral to get married, okay?" Now married to his dead wife's sister, Johann wanted to take his new bride back to his home country of Germany, explaining that it would be good for them to visit his ill father, who would pass in the near future, and leave all of his money to his son. Before they could leave, Johann needed his wife to extend some money to get his business affairs in order before they left, to which Emily handed over $750 to her new husband. As the couple were in a flat they had rented, it was told to them that Marie and Emily's other sister, Bertha, the one who had helped Marie write the letter to Johann, was in the back of their apartment, extremely upset, saying Johann was not only a con man, but a murderer. Johann told his new wife that he was upset and wanted to be left alone, as she went to console and talk to her sister Bertha. Upon returning, Johann was nowhere to be found. Yeah, he bounced. Just poof, fucking gone. So after contacting the police, an Inspector George Shippey was told about the ongoings, and it was decided that the body of Marie would be exhumed and tested with an autopsy. So, who is this Johann Hock guy, and what were his real intentions? Johann Otto Hock was born with the name John Schmidt in Horweiler, Germany in 1855. So sorry if I butchered that. Now, with this being an old case, we all know the details can be hard to find or fluctuate a little depending on the source, so I try my best to use the quote-unquote facts that I find most often and in most sources. I had a hard time finding anything about this man's childhood or what his life might have been like, although I was extremely curious. There wasn't much information before the time that he was old enough to get married, except that some sources claimed that he worked at some point in a few different pharmacies. In fact, some say that this must be where he picked up a few tidbits about how different elements affect the human body. Johann would marry his first wife, according to many sources, a woman named Christine, and this was allegedly his only true marriage throughout his criminal career. I don't know if it's because they never got divorced or what, but him and his first wife would go on to have 3 or 4 children before he would up and abandon them. I tried to find out more on this story as to why he just up and left, but there is scant information before he left the country. After leaving Christine and his family, Johann would allegedly marry another woman named Annie Hock, and this was said to be around 1881 in Austria. Something of note when it comes to Johann is the fact that when he would marry a woman, and let's just say that this is going to be somewhat of a habit when it comes to this man, he would take his new wife's last name, giving himself, again and again, a new alias. Now, it's believed that Johann and Annie could have immigrated to the United States as early as 1881 or 83, but Johann, being the truthful man that he clearly was, would say that it wasn't until the mid-1890s. No one believes that. Either way, when Johann and Annie arrived in the States, they would land in New York. Annie was said to have died a few years later. While there isn't a record of how exactly she died, it's widely believed that she fell prey to her quote-unquote husband. A few months later, Hock's new wife, said to be a young servant who was also an immigrant, sadly, mysteriously, died within 2 months of their marriage. Just a few years later, in 1892, Johann ended up in the Chicago area where he and his newest bride would rent an apartment, and while living here, Johann was going by the name C.A. Meyer before his wife would suddenly die just 3 short weeks later. I'm assuming here that his wife's last name was Meyer then, since I couldn't find a first name anywhere. Just 1 month later, Johann would rent another apartment with another wife, but this time his name was H. Erich, and just a month after moving in with his new wife, she would also suddenly die. 1 year later, in Milwaukee, this time a Dr. James Schmitz, aka Johann, married a woman named Lena Schmitz, who would also die. Johann's MO would be to find a woman in need of a husband because back then, finding a husband was a necessity for a young woman. It wasn't just because young girls dreamed of finding their Prince Charming or partner who would treat them as their queen. It was demanded of women to fulfill their only roles allowed in life as a homemaker and wife. It was their duty, their career, and most of all, usually their only option. Women during this time period didn't have many legal rights. In fact, their entire image socially, as well as their financial stability, mirrored the image of the woman's husband. If a woman was unable to find a suitable husband, or refused to in any case, they would most likely end up in poverty, unable to even make half of what a man would be making at the time. After some research, I found that during the 1890s, a woman's career choices other than a homemaker and wife were limited to a factory, a teacher, or a role in some type of service like a maid or whatever. If a woman went unwed, she would be seen as a spinster, which we've all heard of, or even an old maid. Ugh, the oppression, and not to mention, can you imagine being gay back then? Forced into a life of living, pretending to love, and even having sex with who you were just supposed to rather than who you really wanted to? For any person, not just women. Thankfully, women began to fight for their rights around the same time and for their right to a better education because God forbid we teach a woman that she can do more than make dinner and clean the fucking house. So as you can imagine, the time period where women were probably desperate to find a husband and keep themselves from poverty or being an outcast their entire lives would be akin to a playground for someone like Johann, a con man. Keep this in mind as we go through his list of victims, and we're not even going to be able to get into all of them, just a handful of his victims' cons and swindles, that it's not just that the women were fucking dumb back then, because they weren't. They just didn't have many choices, and even if they could have been naive at times, I wonder why, when they were forced to depend on men their entire lives. After Dr. James Schmitz would lose his wife Lena, he would remarry to the poor woman's sister Clara, who, you guessed it, also died. Back in Chicago in 1894, Hawk would marry another woman with yet a different name, who also died. The very next year, so now we are in 1895, Johann was going by the name C.A. Calford, when he would be arrested for a crime of eloping with a young woman named Janet Spencer, and then abandoning his wife, stealing her money in the process. I remember learning that back in the day, a woman or her family could actually sue a man if he promised her marriage and then backed out, because the woman only had so much time to find a husband, and if he wastes her good years without ever really marrying her, then her parents are left with the financial burden of paying for their daughter for the rest of their life, in some cases. So good for this young lady for turning Johann in when he ran off with a few $100s that he stole. Around this same time, Johann was also caught for stealing diamonds and reportedly kidnapping someone too. Still in the year of 1895, because all of that was before the month of April, Johann would land in West Virginia under the name of Jacob Huff in a city called Wheeling. Now here, he opened up a little bar, back then called a saloon, on Jacob Street, where he would cater to his fellow German immigrants, serving beer, playing traditional German songs, and something called zither music. Yeah, I had never heard of that either. I actually thought that it was like a genre of music and was like, what the fuck is that? It turns out that it's actually an instrument that kind of looks like if you took the frets part of a guitar, you know, like the long part where you hold down your fingers for the notes. Yeah, if you took that off and you placed it right next to the big part of a guitar where you strum, except a smaller version, yeah, that's a zither. It's wild, and you should look it up. Anyways, Johann's saloon was a place for his fellow Germans to hang and Wheeling. A local reverend named C.A. Haas had started paying attention to the fact that Mr. Huff, a.k.a. Johann, seemed to have an affinity for the ladies, particularly the well-off German descent women who happened to be in Reverend Haas's congregation. It was seen that Johann made no bones about the fact that he was looking to marry a rich widow in the area. In fact, he proposed to many. Later, one of the women who had come to the Reverend said simply that Mr. Huff just wanted to settle down and needed a woman to help him with his home, stating that he was offering to take care of them. Apparently, more than a few women turned to their Reverend for advice on marriage or the direction in their life, in particular when it came to Mr. Huff. The Reverend was not a huge fan of Johann's. In fact, he advised the women to hold off on marrying the man until he was known a little better, seemingly not trusting the man at all. His instincts could not have been more right. This wouldn't matter, though, because Johann was able to convince a young local widow named Caroline Hoch that he was the man for her. On April 18, 1895, Reverend Haas, despite his trepidation about Mr. Huff, married the two in a ceremony. Caroline was said to have been fairly well off with a nicer home, roughly $35,000 in today's money, in the bank, equal to $900 back then. And to top it off, she had a life insurance policy worth $2,500 back then, or close to $100,000 today. This would be a jackpot for Huff if he was able to pull it off. After the matrimony, Huff moved in with his new bride, who not long afterwards started to get sick and spiraled quickly. 2 months after the couple had been married, sources said that Reverend Haas was called to Caroline's home when he allegedly witnessed Johann giving his wife some sort of white medication. However, he noticed that Caroline was somewhat reluctant to take it. The Reverend would later recount that he felt Caroline seemed afraid of her new husband, and this is what set firmly in the Reverend's mind that Johann had to be poisoning his wife. Although he had his suspicions, he didn't have any proof, and without proof, he couldn't be 100% sure that this is what was happening. Remember back then, I'm sure there were many ailments and illnesses that seemed kind of mysterious, things that we could now easily probably diagnose, but seemed scary and happened to kill people back then. Still, though, the Reverend seemed to want to find out exactly what was happening before pointing any fingers at what could be a completely innocent Mr. Huff. Reverend Haas would turn to a Gregory Ackerman for help, Dr. Ackerman being a younger local physician that the Reverend may have felt could answer some questions. When the Reverend took the young doctor to Caroline and Johann's home for the doctor to examine her or whatever, sources would say that Johann was not having it. He was seemingly upset about this new doctor, saying that Caroline was already being treated by a Dr. Ford. This would cause the younger physician to excuse himself from the patient and decided not to interfere if she already had medical care, as it could create an ethical issue. And I'm sure there's probably a mutual respect among doctors for them to probably want to not step on anyone else's toes. According to an article written about this case in American Heritage by author A.I. Schutzer, the young physician was later interviewed about this visit to Caroline's home, saying that he could tell that the woman was dying right before his eyes. He further stated that her hands had been swollen, her stomach was also distended, and she could not stop vomiting. He knew that either this woman was being poisoned or she had a case of peritonitis, which, after looking it up, is a life-threatening inflammation of the thin, silky membrane of the lining of the inner abdomen walls that covers the abdominal organs called the peritoneum. When I read further about it, it said that this is usually caused by a fungal or bacterial infection coming from like a trauma or a rupture or a peritoneal dialysis to help kidney failure. So let's talk for a minute about the poisoning he mentioned. Up until now, we haven't truly discussed our killer's method of murder, but some of you may have guessed he was poisoning his victims or alleged wives. Poison, for those of us who are more familiar with true crime, has often been thought of as a woman's weapon for murder. Some believing that maybe women are less capable of brutality and violence, not that they can't, because believe me, we all know and have even covered cases where women are right up there in that category with men, but since women weren't exactly taught how to fight, how to kill in wars, or how to use a weapon, they may have used what was at their already disposal, i.e. foods and medicines or poisons. So this case is interesting in the fact that we have a man poisoning his wives, seemingly still heartless, cold-blooded, and didn't seem to care much that he was just killing these women off, but he still chose poison. Was it because it would look more natural and less suspicious? Was it because he enjoyed the slow and painful burning from the inside out, where he would smile to himself at his wives' suffering and excruciating deaths? Maybe. Either way, this man was able to get away with his crimes for over a decade by eluding authorities with aliases, marriages, and his weapon of choice. The morning after the young physician had stopped by to take a look at Caroline, the Reverend would be informed around 8 a.m. that just 2 hours earlier, the young widow bride had passed away. The very next day, Johann would have his new wife buried in a cemetery on the outskirts of Wheeling, and although he faked the tears when people were around, Reverend Haas wasn't buying it, and he started poking around to learn more. What he found would only substantiate his thought that Johann, or Mr. Huff, indeed had ulterior motives in marrying Caroline. Reverend Haas found out that not only was Mr. Huff in some serious debt to whoever supplied his beer, but that he had also been forced to shut down his saloon. He realized the best way to get answers was to try and find out what the powdery white substance medicine was that Huff had been giving his new bride. He went to all of the pharmacies in town asking if Johann had been filling any prescriptions for himself or his wife, to which they had all said no, he had not. Dr. Ford had thought that she had something that there wasn't a cure for, therefore he probably hadn't written any prescriptions. The Reverend then thought maybe he could go back to the room and find the white powder or at least traces of whatever it was, but when he got there, he realized everything had been cleaned up and there was nothing to find. This led the Reverend to realize that Johann may already realize the Reverend is suspicious and he was trying to get rid of any evidence in case anyone came looking. Sources said not long after this, the Reverend found himself becoming ill, but within a week or so, he had recovered. However, one night, while he was sitting down to dinner with his wife, he heard a noise coming from the upstairs bedroom. The Reverend rushed upstairs to find Johann in his bedroom. After demanding to know what the fuck the man was doing in his bedroom, Johann used his acting skills to try and pretend he was merely looking for the Reverend to have a good talk with him. Bullshit. The Reverend wasn't dumb and realized that Johann could have been poisoning his own bottles of medicine, so he threw them all away, only later realizing that he should have tested them instead. The very next day, the Reverend would be informed by the police that they had come upon Mr. Huff's clothing with his pocket watch and a picture of himself alongside a suicide note near the side of the Ohio River. And wouldn't you know it, there had even been footprints leading down to the river, leading the authorities to believe that Mr. Huff, in his depressed state over losing his young bride so suddenly, had committed suicide. However, even after dredging the river to find evidence of said suicide, no body was ever found. Johann was already headed back to Chicago. But July 15th, still in the same year, I'm telling you this man was fucking busy, and he's just back-to-back marrying and killing these poor women. By July 15th, Johann had bought another saloon, this time in Chicago, and by the first week in August, he had already found himself a new wife. Maria Steinbacher and Johann were married. Just 4 short months later, she died. Regardless of the fact that not long before Maria died, she had proclaimed that she believed she was being poisoned, but no one had really listened to her. One source would say that her own family had tried to delay the funeral so that her body could be tested for any poisons, but after her death, Johann sold her property for $4,000 or $158K today, and this was Johann's pattern. Every few months, he would find a single woman with money or a well-off widow, charm them, marry them, and they would mysteriously die short after. As he was going along, people were starting to take notice, though. In fact, not long after Mr. Huff allegedly killed himself after the death of Caroline, someone reached out to the Reverend saying that they had seen him and he was indeed alive and with a new woman. This, in turn, had the Reverend reach out to police where Johann had been spotted, telling them that this man was a con artist, a swindler, and most likely a murderer. Sources said that the police hadn't responded because the name that the Reverend had sent didn't ring any bells. He was most likely using a different alias by now, but this didn't deter Reverend Haas from trying to start his own investigation into the man that he knew as Mr. Huff. Apparently, the Reverend had an inkling this man was doing this all over the place and would take particular interest in marriage announcements and obituaries, noting the times where a young woman died not long after her marriage and the husband had either taken off, or if there had been a case of a woman whose husband fled with her money after they had been wed. By the time the Reverend was able to track down where Johann might be and send a letter to the police nearby, he was already gone. Eventually, the Chicago police had arrested a man named Martin Dotz, who had been charged with 1 count of swindling a used furniture dealer out of some merchandise, and also 1 count of bigamy, meaning marrying somebody while you're still married to another person. At the time of his arrest, Reverend Haas had a sneaking suspicion due to the physical description that was printed alongside the man's name that this was Johann. So he wrote to the captain of the detective force in Chicago and included a picture asking them to compare it to the man that they had arrested to see if this was the same man that he believed had killed Caroline Hoch back in Wheeling, West Virginia. In turn, the man who would help to bring this serial killer to justice and a major player in the case, aforementioned Inspector George Shippey, was given the picture and the information, who then took it to confront Johann about the information he had. Before he knew why he was being asked this, he confirmed that Shippey was indeed holding a picture of himself in his hand, basically just confirming that he was a suspect in a murder without knowing it. This had indeed been the picture that Mr. Huff had left behind with his alleged suicide note by the Ohio River. The authorities then went to the used furniture dealer who had been trying to get charges pressed against Johann for swindling him, where the shop owner had records of furnishings bought in the last year for Johann, where it would show multiple times a year Johann would purchase furniture for yet another wife he had. I guess it hadn't really occurred to the shop owner what was happening, just that this man was getting married often. But I can understand, especially back then, you may not think of the immediate worst when a man brings you business a few times a year, right? Well, get this. According to the American Heritage article, on one occasion, the shop owner had actually attended a funeral for Johann's deceased wife, and it happened to be Maria's death, the woman who was proclaiming that she had been poisoned before she died, the same one whose family tried to stop the funeral for her body to be tested. Well, the shop owner overheard the family in a big argument that broke out at the cemetery, with the coroner in hand, saying that Maria had sworn as she was dying that her new husband was poisoning her with a white, powdery substance. In turn, Johann proved, by showing them the death certificate, that the physician who was there stated she had died of natural causes, which of course he probably did. How the fuck would he know? He was able to shut down the suspicions quickly, and the funeral proceeded. As Shippey was starting to build a case against Johann, he was able to interview some of the women who had claimed to be married to the serial killer at one point or another. Now, officially, I believe that he was known to have killed at least 15 women, but the authorities estimate that it was closer to about 50 women. Yeah, 50! That's just so many women to have conned and killed. What was he spending all of that money on? During one interview Inspector Shippey was conducting with a wife who was lucky enough to live, the woman was allegedly married to Jakob Erdorf, aka Johann, who was posing as some type of religious employee of sorts. I don't know if it was like a father or a pastor or what, but he managed to convince his new bride Martha and her sister that the bank in which they were holding their money, totaling $2,600 back then, was about to go under. He came to the rescue, though, as they both pulled out the money and gave it to him, to where he assured them that he was going to deposit the money in his own name at maybe a more secure bank. Well, he just never came back. Eventually, the police in Chicago would correspond with Reverend Haas by sending a letter stating that they used the photo to confirm the identity of the man that they had in custody for the bigamy and robbery as indeed the same person in the picture. However, the man in the picture, aka Johann, had asserted that he had never had any dealings or even lived in Wheeling, West Virginia. Reverend Haas was smart, and really the whole thing seemed to have come together because this man kept on Johann and did the right thing time and time again. He took the letter from the Chicago police and all of the evidence that he had collected from the various newspapers, the weddings, the obituaries, and went straight to the West Virginia state attorney, a Mr. Mayer. With the evidence presented, it was found that the body of Miss Caroline Hoch would indeed be exhumed and examined. Caroline's grave was dug up and her coffin was opened on November 14th, 1898, where the men present would find a body that had a massive hole where the victim's stomach should have been. Now, I'm a fucking moron, but in my mind, I was like, oh my god, the poison ate away at her stomach. No. It was believed that someone had at some point cut out all of the woman's organs and also her stomach in pursuit of hiding any traces of poison or evidence against Johann. After being let out of jail in Chicago, Johann was taken straight to West Virginia to stand trial for the murder of Caroline, but because her organs were missing, they didn't really have any evidence that he actually did anything wrong, so he eventually walked free. This did not stop his trail of bodies, however, as Johann would go straight to Indiana and start his campaigns all over again. One woman reportedly wasn't taking any of his bullshit, though, and although Johann tried to hypnotize her with his new certificate in hypnosis, trying to get her to sign over all of her finances, she said hell no. And when she got sick, she refused all of his medicines, saying that if she didn't get better quickly, she was going straight to the hospital. Figuring that he wasn't going to get what he wanted from this woman, Johann booked it. Eventually, Johann would make his way back to Chicago, where he would place an advertisement for a new wife in the local newspaper, where a candy store owner, Miss Marie Walker, would happen upon it. Remember Marie from the beginning, the woman with the candy shop who mysteriously died, and then Johann proposed to her sister just a few moments later. Yes, this poor woman. This would be the only person that Johann was actually charged for murdering, despite the fact that there were dozens more. During the trial for murder, which would start May 19, 1905, sources said that Johann was said to have twiddled his thumbs, whistled little ditties, and hummed tunes to himself, seemingly not giving two shits about the trial unfolding in front of him. Do you think that's because he didn't think that he would be found guilty, or was he just a psychopath who didn't give a shit either way? Johann would be found guilty for the murder, and on June 23rd, he would be handed the death sentence. His execution was set to take place on August 25th, just 2 months later, after being found guilty. During his wait on the short stint of what we would call now death row, a woman would give him some money to try and appeal his sentence, which would delay his death sentence until the Supreme Court of Illinois would take a look at it that December. However, they didn't do anything about the case or the sentence. While Johann had been awaiting his execution, sources said that not only did Johann receive marriage proposals from various women, which is just like, what in the actual fuck? But also, he would do an interview with the Chicago Sun newspaper where he would share his own set of rules for getting women to fall in love with him. According to the Big Book of Serial Killers, Volume 2, written by Jack Rosewood and Rebecca Lowe, one of my personal favorites, Johann stated the following 6 things about the topic. Quote, "Women like being told pleasant things about themselves. When you make love, be ardent and earnest." Yeah, I had to look up what ardent meant. It means showing intense or passionate feelings, deep devotion, or extreme enthusiasm. Okay, now we're back in the quote. "Never let a woman know her own shortcomings. 9 out of every 10 women can be won with flattery. Always appear to a woman to be the anxious one. And finally, the average man can fool the average woman if he will only let her have her own way at the start, end quote. According to an article in the Chicago Tribune published the very same day that Johann would be led to the gallows to pay for his crimes, the article states that not only does Johann confess that all of his hope for anything to change was gone, but that people who believed he was actually innocent would come and visit him in jail. The article spoke to the fact that some of the people who basically rallied around Johann during this time were quote-unquote odd characters. One in particular tried to basically hypnotize Johann, asking the prisoner to look into his eyes. And this is when Johann would laugh in his face and turn his back to the man attempting to help his mental state. I guess some of the people who thought Johann was innocent were considered spiritualists, and one of them even claimed that the spirit of Marie Walker herself, the woman Johann was found guilty of murdering, came to them and was told that Johann is innocent. I mean, come on. One of the visitors turned out to be Emily Fisher, the woman who married him after the death of her sister. Not long before his execution, Johann would state that he felt he was being sacrificed to save the reputations of a few state attorneys and governors, completely denying his actions. Johann was set to be hanged on February 23, 1906 at 2 p.m., to which he told the authorities that he planned to fight them if they came at him even 1 minute before 1:30, since his death sentence was to be carried out at 2. It just screamed to me that he was still so desperate for control. At exactly 1:30 p.m., Johann started what they would call his death march to be hanged. Johann said something about being done with this world before the trap was sprung and he was executed. Sources would say after Johann was executed that several cemeteries straight up refused to allow the monster to be buried on their grounds, with him eventually being buried in a potter's field, which I guess is a public burial ground for people who aren't claimed, whose identities are never figured out, or for people who can't afford a cemetery plot. I don't know if these are still a thing or if it was just back then, but Johann Otto Hach would be quoted as stating, "Women are all right in their place, but marry only one at a time." End quote. Fuck you, dude, and good riddance. And that, my friends, is the story of Johann Otto Hach, conman, bigamist, and serial killer of women all over the East. Oh man, I hated this fucker. While I personally love a good conman story, I hate a conman murderer who takes advantage of only women back in a time where women weren't allowed to do shit on their own. It's crazy to think that there will never be an accurate account of just how many victims this man had. I wish they would be given the opportunity, like, for every name or victim you give us, we will spare your life for like 1 more month, or something like that, so that they could find the victims and give their families some closures on their deaths. Not that losing a loved one ever really gets closure, but at least the information would be known. The poison that Johann was believed to have been using was arsenic, which just does so much shit to your body. During this case, I had to look up, like, what exactly happens to someone when it takes it, because I was fucking curious. And there's like a myriad of things, like vomiting, bloody diarrhea, blood vessel damage, circulatory collapse, encephalopathy, seizures, comas, confusion, and even multi-system shutdown of vital organs. I can only imagine the pain that these women were forced to endure, probably to the point where death was welcome just to be out of pain, because back then, I imagine they had to suffer from pain like no other. I was a little shocked that anyone at the end would believe in his innocence. He must have been just that good, because with all of these women gone and circumstantial evidence, there's just no doubt that this man was a depraved individual who just didn't give a flying fuck. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed learning about this fucked up case as much as I did, and remember that if your partner is trying to give you a medicine not from a package, you just smack that shit right out of their hand. Come on back next Monday where we will cover another case here on The Kill File where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.
Thank you so much for hanging out and listening to today's episode here on The Kill File. Check out the website at TheKillFile.com to suggest a case or find the merch shop. Follow us on social media for weekly reminders about episodes, to share your thoughts, or to find bonus pictures from the cases. Remember to lock your doors, lock your windows, and stay safe. See you next Monday for another story here on The Kill File.